My home was supposed to be my sanctuary, the one place on earth where I could feel safe. That all changed the day I saw flashing lights and found two uniformed officers on my porch, ready to put me in handcuffs. Their reason? A complaint from the new HOA president, a woman who accused me of turning my property into a public nuisance. And what was my supposed crime that warranted an arrest? A disagreement over the color of my mailbox. I was being treated like a hardened criminal, humiliated in front of my entire neighborhood over something so trivial. She thought she had all the power, a lonely woman desperate to control everyone around her. But she made one critical mistake. She had no idea who she was really trying to intimidate. 4 years, my life had been a series of high-stakes, high-stress situations where a single wrong move could have permanent consequences. When I finally stepped away from my career, all I wanted was the opposite. I wanted quiet. I wanted a routine so predictable it was boring. I found what I was looking for in a small, sleepy subdivision called Willow Creek, a place where the biggest news was the annual bake sale and the loudest sound was the Saturday morning symphony of lawnmowers. I bought a modest single-story house, painted the shutters a quiet gray, and settled into a life of blissful anonymity. My days were simple. I'd wake with the sun, drink my coffee on the back patio listening to the birds, and spend my afternoons in the garage with my woodworking projects. I wasn't unfriendly, but I kept to myself. I'd offer a polite wave to my neighbors during my morning walk, and I always made sure my lawn was neatly trimmed. I wasn't just being a good neighbor, I was actively cultivating peace. This house, this quiet street, it wasn't just a place to live, it was my recovery. It was the sanctuary I had earned, and I protected its tranquility fiercely. The homeowners association was a non-entity, a simple fee I paid once a year to keep the entrance sign looking nice. The old president, a retired schoolteacher named Mr. Henderson, ran it with a light touch. His philosophy was simple: don't be a nuisance and be good to each other. For 2 years, that's exactly what it was. Then Mr. Henderson moved away to be closer to his grandchildren, and a woman named Carol Peterson was elected as the new HOA president. The shift was almost immediate. The friendly monthly newsletters were replaced with weekly community bulletins that read more like legal warnings. Suddenly, there were new, incredibly specific rules. The shade of white for window trim was now regulated. Holiday decorations had to be removed within 48 hours of the holiday ending. A sense of being watched settled over the neighborhood. I started seeing Carol on my morning walks, not enjoying the day but patrolling. She carried a clipboard and would occasionally stop, squinting at a home, and jot something down. She never made eye contact, but you could feel her presence, a silent, judgmental shadow casting itself over our quiet lives. My first interaction with her new regime was a laminated note tucked under my windshield wiper. A friendly reminder. It began in a font that was anything but friendly. The HOA covenants state that vehicles cannot be parked in the same driveway spot for more than 72 consecutive hours to maintain community aesthetics. I had been working on a large project in the garage and hadn't moved my truck in 4 days. It was parked on my own property, not blocking anything, not making a sound. The sheer pettiness of it was astounding, but I didn't want trouble. I backed the truck out, drove it around the block, and parked it in the exact same spot. It was a ridiculous, passive-aggressive dance, but if it kept the peace, I was willing to do it. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. A week later, I received a formal violation letter in the mail, complete with a grainy photograph of my front garden. My crime? Using pine bark mulch instead of the newly mandated, triple-shredded oak hardwood mulch. The letter included a $10 fine, which would double every week it went unpaid. It was no longer about community aesthetics, it was a power trip. I paid the fine and spent a weekend replacing the mulch, feeling a growing sense of resentment. The peace I had so carefully built was being chipped away by this woman's obsession with control. The final piece of the puzzle, the one that would set everything in motion, was my mailbox. It was the original one that came with the house, a standard metal box that had started to rust at the base. One Saturday I decided to replace it. I went to the hardware store and bought a sturdy, high-quality steel mailbox. It was simple, black, and completely inoffensive. I spent the afternoon digging out the old post, setting the new one in concrete, and mounting the box perfectly level. It looked clean, respectable, and new. I felt a small sense of pride in the improvement. The next morning, as I sipped my coffee, I saw Carol on her morning patrol. She stopped directly in front of my house, her eyes fixed on the new mailbox. She stood there for a full minute, pulled out a small measuring tape from her pocket, and then made a series of furious notes on her clipboard. A slow, thin smile spread across her face before she turned and walked away. I didn't know what rule I could have possibly broken, but I knew with absolute certainty that this was far from over. The official notice arrived 2 days later, delivered by certified mail as if it were a court summons. It was a single, professionally printed sheet of paper detailing my violation. According to Article 7, Section 4B of the newly amended Community Bylaws, my mailbox was non-compliant on 2 fronts. First, its powder-coated steel construction was a deviation from the approved cast aluminum material. Second, its height, which I had carefully set to the standard 44 inches, exceeded the new maximum of 42 inches. The rule was so specific, so tailored to my new installation that it was laughable. Carol had clearly held a board meeting with herself and her 2 cronies, invented a rule out of thin air, and was now trying to pass it off as established covenant. The notice concluded by informing me that a fine of $50 per day would be levied against my property until the non-compliant structure was removed. My first instinct wasn't anger, but a cold, methodical need for facts. I spent that evening digging out the thick binder of HOA covenants I received when I closed on the house. I read every single page, every line of dense legalese. As I suspected, there was no mention of mailbox materials, and the only height stipulation was a minimum, not a maximum. Her new rule was a complete fabrication. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to attend the next monthly HOA meeting. I had never been to one, assuming them to be tedious affairs discussing lawn care budgets. When I walked into the community clubhouse, I saw it was exactly that, but with an undercurrent of authoritarianism. Carol sat at the head of a long table, flanked by 2 other board members who nodded along to her every word. Only 5 other residents were in attendance. When the floor opened for new business, I calmly stood up, introduced myself, and presented my case. I explained that I had replaced a rusted, unsightly mailbox with a new one. I held up the violation letter, then held up the official book of covenants. I pointed out, politely but firmly, that the rules cited in the letter did not exist in the official, legally binding documents. I wasn't accusatory, I simply laid out the facts. I expected a discussion, perhaps an admission of a mistake. Instead, I was met with a condescending smile from Carol. She didn't even look at the documents. She informed me and the room that an emergency amendment had been passed by the board due to aesthetic inconsistencies in the neighborhood. The updated bylaws, she claimed, were being mailed out next week. She looked me dead in the eye and said, "The fines stand, Mr. Edwards. The rules apply to everyone." The other board members just stared at their notes. The other residents just stared at the floor. I left that meeting with a knot of ice in my stomach. Logic was not a currency here. This was not about rules. This was a personal attack, and the system was rigged. As I walked home, I looked at my new mailbox. It was no longer just a mailbox. It was a symbol. And I decided right then that I wasn't taking it down. That decision turned my life into a quiet nightmare. The $50 daily fines were just the beginning. Carol launched a campaign of relentless psychological harassment. Her morning patrols became an all-day affair. I'd see her drive by slowly multiple times a day. If I was outside, she'd stop her car, get out, and take pictures of my house with her phone, making no effort to be discreet. My home, my sanctuary, now felt like a prison where I was under constant surveillance. She began talking to my neighbors, spinning a tale of a difficult new resident who refused to follow the rules and was driving down property values. My friendly waves to neighbors were soon met with nervous glances and hurried retreats indoors. I was being systematically isolated, painted as the villain in a story she was writing for the entire community. The violation notices became a flood, a weapon of attrition designed to bury me in paperwork and fines. One morning, I found a notice for my garden hose being improperly coiled. Another appeared because a small, barely visible oil spot, common to any driveway, was deemed a hazardous material violation. She fined me for having a small American flag mount next to my door, calling it an unapproved structural modification, a claim that was not only absurd but borderline unpatriotic. Each violation came with its own fine, its own deadline, its own threat. The total was climbing into the thousands. I was a man who had faced down armed criminals and navigated complex federal investigations, yet I felt a profound sense of helplessness. How do you fight an enemy who invents the rules as they go, who operates in a realm devoid of logic and reason? The stress began to wear on me. The tranquility I had moved here for was gone, replaced by a constant, simmering anxiety. The tipping point arrived via certified mail a month into this ordeal. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from a law firm. Carol had used HOA funds to hire a lawyer to send me an official demand letter. It listed over $5,000 in accumulated fines and legal fees. It stated that if the amount was not paid within 30 days, the HOA would place a lien on my property. This was the moment the game changed. This was no longer a petty dispute with a power-hungry neighbor. This was a direct threat to my home, my financial security, and the peaceful life I had worked so hard to build. I sat at my kitchen table, the letters spread out before me, and the fog of frustration and helplessness finally burned away, replaced by something cold and sharp: resolve. I had tried to handle this like a quiet, private citizen. I had tried to be reasonable. I had respected the process even when it was being abused. But they had pushed too far. They had mistaken my patience for weakness. They were about to learn that they had not just targeted a quiet woodworker. They had declared war on a United States Marshal. My training kicked in. The first rule in any conflict is to know your enemy and the terrain. I put my emotions aside and began to work. I spent the next 2 weeks not on my lawn but on my computer. I wasn't just a resident anymore, I was an investigator. I conducted a deep dive into the state laws governing homeowners associations, discovering a wealth of regulations about board conduct, financial transparency, and homeowner rights that Carol was flagrantly violating. I ran a background check on Carol herself, uncovering a history of frivolous lawsuits and disputes in her previous workplaces. I submitted a formal request for all of the HOA's financial records and meeting minutes for the past 2 years, an action I was legally entitled to, but which I knew would send a shockwave through her little kingdom. Carol's response to my formal request was not legal compliance, but panicked escalation. She must have interpreted my silence and my legal maneuvering as a sign that I was preparing a major counterattack. In her mind, she couldn't afford to let that happen. She needed to crush me, to make a public example of me before I could expose her. She needed a finale, a checkmate move that would humiliate me into submission or force me out of the neighborhood entirely. Her ego and paranoia led her to an idea that was not just stupid but dangerously illegal. It happened on a bright Tuesday morning. I was in my home office reviewing a statute about improper HOA liens when I heard a commotion outside. I saw a few of my neighbors peeking out their windows, their phones held up. Carol had clearly told them to watch the show. Then a car pulled up to my curb. It was a black sedan fitted with a cheap, flashing light bar on the roof and a decal on the side that read Community Enforcement. It was a laughable attempt to mimic an unmarked police car. 2 large men in ill-fitting, security guard-style uniforms got out. They walked up my driveway with a swagger that was clearly practiced. Across the street, I could see Carol standing on her porch, arms crossed, a triumphant smirk plastered on her face. This was her masterpiece. One of the men pounded on my front door, the sound echoing through my quiet house. I took a deep, steadying breath, the kind I used to take before breaching a door. I knew exactly what this was. A pathetic, illegal charade. And I knew with absolute certainty how it was going to end. I walked to the door and opened it. The man in front, clearly the leader, puffed out his chest. He was trying to use his size to intimidate me, a tactic that might have worked on someone else. "We're from Community Enforcement," he said, his voice a low, rehearsed growl. "We're here on behalf of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. You're in violation of multiple covenants, and we've been authorized to escort you from the premises for trespassing." I let a moment of silence hang in the air, my expression unreadable. Across the street, I could see Carol watching, soaking in her moment of triumph. "Trespassing?" I repeated, my voice perfectly level. "This is my property. I own it. Could you please cite the specific state or federal statute that allows a private citizen to be removed from their own deeded property for an alleged HOA violation?" The man's confident smirk flickered. He clearly wasn't expecting a legal question. He was expecting fear. "Look, buddy, we don't have time for games," his partner chimed in, stepping forward. "Carol, Miss Peterson, she said you're a problem. We're here to solve the problem. Now you can come with us quietly, or we can do this the hard way." He reached out and placed his hand firmly on my doorframe, leaning in as if to block my exit. It was a classic intimidation move, a physical assertion of dominance. It was also a massive, career-ending mistake. In an instant, the quiet, frustrated homeowner they saw before them was gone. My posture shifted, my shoulders squared, and the look in my eyes hardened into something they had likely only ever seen in movies. The change was so immediate, so total, that both men took an involuntary step back. "Take your hand off my property," I said. The words were quiet, but they carried the unmistakable weight of command. The man snatched his hand back as if the wood had suddenly become white-hot. You have 5 seconds to produce state-issued identification and proof of your license to operate as a private security entity in this jurisdiction. I continued, my voice cold and precise. Because right now, you are on my property attempting to impersonate peace officers, which is a felony. You have threatened me with physical force and unlawful detainment, which constitutes assault and attempted kidnapping, also felonies. The lead man started to stammer, a flush of red creeping up his neck. Now hold on, we're not. He was cut short as I reached inside my jacket. They both tensed, their eyes wide with panic. I slowly pulled out my wallet and flipped it open, not to a driver's license, but to the gold shield and credentials of the U.S. Department of Justice. My name is Alex Edwards, I stated, my voice cutting through the morning air. I am a Deputy United States Marshal. And you two are in a world of trouble. I let them stare at the credentials, watching as the full, terrifying reality of their situation crashed down on them. The color drained from their faces. Their tough guy personas dissolved into pure, undiluted fear. They looked like children who had been caught playing with their father's gun. I let the silence stretch for another beat before I delivered the final blow. And you know, I said, glancing past them towards the street, impersonating a federal officer is a much more serious crime. I'd imagine the FBI will be very interested to hear how this little enforcement agency of yours operates. Right on cue, as if summoned by my words, 2 real marked police cruisers turned the corner. I had called 911 the moment I saw the fake car pull up, identifying myself as a federal officer witnessing felonies in progress. That kind of call gets a very, very fast response. The cruisers glided to a stop, their lights painting the entire street in flashing strobes of red and blue. Professional, uniformed officers emerged, their movements calm and efficient. The entire dynamic of the scene inverted. The 2 imposters who had been trying to project power just moments before now looked small and pathetic. They raised their hands instinctively, their faces etched with the dawning horror of their miscalculation. Across the street, Carol's jaw was hanging open. Her triumphant smirk had been replaced by a mask of chalky, horrified disbelief. This wasn't the show she had planned. The public humiliation she had engineered for me was now unfolding on her own front lawn, but she was the star. One of the real officers, a seasoned-looking sergeant, approached me while his partner began questioning the 2 frozen imposters. I briefly explained the situation, the HOA dispute, the harassment, and Carol's hiring of these men to illegally remove me from my home. As I spoke, the 2 fake cops, realizing their only hope was to cooperate, began singing like canaries, pointing directly at Carol and admitting she had hired them and told them exactly what to do and say. The sergeant listened patiently, then walked directly across the street to where Carol was still standing, frozen on her porch. The whole neighborhood was watching now. Every window seemed to have a face in it. I could hear the murmur of voices, the frantic whispers of neighbors witnessing the complete collapse of their HOA president's authority. Carol began to bluster, her voice high and shrill, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that they were just community liaisons there to mediate. But her lies were transparent, her panic palpable. The sergeant was unmoved. After a brief, pointed conversation, he spoke into his radio. A few moments later, he turned back to her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice loud enough for many of us to hear, "you are being detained for questioning regarding conspiracy to commit a felony and hiring individuals to impersonate peace officers. Please put your hands behind your back." The spectacle was complete. Carol Peterson, the woman who ruled our neighborhood with an iron fist and a clipboard, was being led off her own porch in handcuffs. The neighbors who had once feared her were now recording her downfall on their phones. I watched as they placed her in the back of a squad car, her face a contorted mask of rage and humiliation, a fallen tyrant staring out at the kingdom she had lost. The car door shut and she was driven away, leaving a stunned silence in her wake. I stood on my porch, the morning sun warming my face. The immediate threat was gone. I looked over at my simple black mailbox, the absurdly trivial object that had started this entire war. It stood there, solid, straight, and unmoved. The battle was over, but the war for the soul of Willow Creek had just claimed its biggest casualty. The departure of the police cars, with Carol in the back of one and her 2 hired thugs in another, didn't bring the morning's drama to a neat close. Instead, it left a vacuum. The flashing lights were gone, but the entire neighborhood seemed to be holding its breath. Neighbors who had been recording on their phones slowly lowered them, emerging from their doorways like spectators after a sudden, violent storm. They looked at the empty space where Carol's car used to be, then at me standing on my porch. Their expressions were a mixture of shock, confusion, and a dawning, hesitant relief. For the first time in months, I wasn't met with averted eyes or nervous glances. I was met with genuine curiosity. A few of them gave me a tentative nod, a silent acknowledgement that the world had just been turned upside down. The legal process, as it turned out, was swift and decisive. With my testimony as a federal officer, video evidence from half a dozen neighbors, and the full, panicked confessions of the two men she hired, Carol's case was airtight. She was facing a raft of felony charges, from conspiracy to the unlawful impersonation of peace officers. The investigation also triggered a mandatory audit of the HOA's finances, which quickly revealed she had improperly used community funds to pay the retainer for the law firm that threatened me and to hire her community enforcement squad. Faced with a mountain of evidence and the prospect of significant jail time, she did what most bullies do when their power is stripped away. She crumbled. She took a plea deal that involved extensive probation, thousands of dollars in restitution to the HOA, and court-mandated therapy. The most crucial part of her sentence, however, was a lifetime ban from ever serving on any board or in any fiduciary capacity for any organization, ever again. Within 2 months, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. She was gone, a quiet and ignominious end to her reign of terror. Her departure left a power vacuum in the HOA. The remaining 2 board members, who had acted as little more than her silent enablers, called an emergency community meeting. They were clearly terrified, expecting a full-blown resident revolt. I attended, not with the intention of speaking but simply to observe. The clubhouse, which had been nearly empty during my last visit, was now packed. Every seat was taken and people were standing along the walls. The air was thick with anger and uncertainty. When the floor was opened, the room erupted. People who had been fined for the color of their mulch, the placement of their garbage cans, or the brand of their garden gnomes finally found their voice. It was a flood of frustration, a collective catharsis for a year of petty tyranny. All eyes eventually turned to me. A neighbor I'd never spoken to stood up and asked the question everyone was thinking: what do we do now? I had never wanted a leadership role in this community. I had moved here for anonymity, for peace. But I realized in that moment that true peace isn't just the absence of conflict. It's the presence of a just and stable environment. I had inadvertently dismantled the old regime, and I had a responsibility to help build something better in its place. I walked to the front of the room. I didn't run for president. I didn't want that kind of power. Instead, I proposed the formation of a temporary restoration committee. Our single goal would be to review and reform the HOA's bylaws to ensure this could never happen again. The vote was unanimous. For the next 3 months, our committee worked tirelessly. Our first act was to declare a full amnesty, nullifying every fine and violation Carol had issued. We then spearheaded a complete overhaul of the covenants. We didn't eliminate the rules, but we simplified them, grounding them in common sense and mutual respect rather than arbitrary control. We added new clauses requiring a 2/3 majority vote from the entire community for any new rule to be adopted. We put term limits on board members and established a clear, independent process for disputing violations. We were taking the power out of the hands of a few and giving it back to the community where it belonged. The most satisfying moment was mailing out checks from the HOA's accounts, refunding every single dollar that had been paid in fines during Carol's tenure. It was more than just money, it was a restoration of justice. Slowly but surely, Willow Creek began to heal. The oppressive atmosphere of surveillance lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of neighborliness. People started talking to each other again. Block parties, which had died out under Carol, were suddenly being planned. I'd be working in my garage and a neighbor would stop by, not to report me for a violation, but to ask for advice on a project or to offer me a cold drink. My desire for quiet solitude had evolved. I still valued my privacy, my peaceful mornings on the patio, but it was now complemented by the quiet security of being part of a true community, one that had been tested by fire and emerged stronger. I was no longer the mysterious recluse. I was Alex, the guy who had stood up to the HOA. My past as a marshal was my own business, but my actions as a neighbor had defined me here, and I was content with that. Every morning when I walk out to get my mail, I see the mailbox that started it all. It's just a simple black steel box, perfectly level, standing at a height of 44 inches. It's unremarkable in every way except for the story it tells. It serves as a quiet reminder that power, especially in small places, can be a dangerous thing in the wrong hands. A person consumed by a need for control can turn a peaceful community into a battlefield over the most trivial of things. But it also reminds me of something more important, that you should never have to surrender your peace or your rights to a bully. The fight wasn't won the day the police showed up. It was one in the quiet moments before, when I chose to read the rules, to understand my rights, and to stand my ground armed not with force but with facts. The system, whether in a federal courthouse or a suburban HOA, can only be corrupted if good people choose to remain silent. My home is my sanctuary once more, but now it's protected by more than just walls and a lock. It's protected by the hard-won peace of a community that learned to stand together.